She gave her last $50. Not to her grandson who needed it. Not to her electric bill that was overdue. Not to the pharmacy where her prescription waited. She gave it to the church. Because that's what Pastor Walker said God wanted. And 3 weeks later, when Eleanor Brooks collapsed in her kitchen from untreated diabetes, when the ambulance came and the paramedics found her alone, when her daughter arrived at the hospital crying and asking why didn't you tell me you couldn't afford your medication, Eleanor whispered through tears, I thought God would provide. Pastor said if I gave, God would provide. Her daughter held her hand. And asked the question that changed everything. Mom, where did your money actually go? That question, that simple, devastating question, would unravel 40 years of lies. It would expose a system so calculated, so deliberately designed to extract everything from people like Eleanor, that by the end of this story, you'll understand why some people never walk into a church again. This isn't about losing faith. This is about discovering where your faith actually went. And who got rich from it. Before we go any further, I need to know you're really here. If you're ready to see where this goes no matter how uncomfortable it gets, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications. Because what you're about to hear isn't easy. It's not comfortable. But it's true. And if you've ever felt manipulated by someone you trusted, if you've ever given more than you could afford because you were told God required it, if you've ever questioned whether the institution matched the faith it claimed to represent, then you need to hear this. Drop a comment right now telling us where you're watching from. Let's build a community of people who aren't afraid to ask hard questions. Now, let's continue. Thomas Walker didn't start out planning to become what he became. That's important to understand. Because the most dangerous manipulators don't wake up one day and decide to destroy people. They slide into it. Slowly. Justification by justification. Compromise by compromise. Until one day they look in the mirror and don't recognize what they've become. But by then, they're too invested to stop. Thomas grew up in a small town in rural Pennsylvania. His father was a factory worker. His mother cleaned houses. They were poor, the kind of poor where you wear the same shoes until they fall apart, where dinner is sometimes just rice and butter, where Christmas means one gift if you're lucky. But they went to church every Sunday. And at church, Thomas saw something that fascinated him. The pastor, Reverend Donald, lived differently. He had a nice car. A big house. His kids went to college. And every Sunday, people gave him money. Handed it over willingly, gratefully even, because Reverend Donald told them it was God's will. Thomas was 12 when he first thought, I want to do that. Not preach. Not serve. Not help people. He wanted the life that came with the position. The respect. The comfort. The control. He went to Bible college because that's what you did if you wanted to be a pastor. He learned Greek and Hebrew. He memorized theology. He studied church history and systematic doctrine. But what really interested him were the elective courses. Church administration. Nonprofit management. Leadership psychology. He took every class that taught him how organizations worked, how people made decisions, how groups could be influenced. He graduated with honors. And he was hired immediately by a small church in Ohio, Grace Community Church, population 200 members, annual budget $90,000. The previous pastor had retired. The congregation was aging. Giving was declining. The building needed repairs. Most young pastors would have seen this as a challenge. Thomas saw it as an opportunity. He spent his first year studying the congregation. Not their spiritual needs. Their psychological profiles. He visited every member at home. He asked questions. What did they do for work? What were their fears? Their regrets? Their dreams? He took notes. Detailed notes. He created a database, long before it was common for churches to do this, with every piece of information he could gather. Who gave how much? Who had influence? Who was vulnerable? Who could be leveraged? Then he started preaching differently. Not from theology. From psychology. He told stories that targeted specific people in the room. He would mention a struggle, never naming anyone, but making it specific enough that the person would know, would feel seen, would feel like God was speaking directly to them through him. And it worked. People started calling him anointed. Prophetic. They said he had a gift for knowing what people needed to hear. What they didn't know was that he had files on them. Literal files. Every prayer request. Every counseling session. Every confession. All documented. All catalogued. All weaponized. Within 3 years, the church doubled. Within 5 years, it tripled. Within 10 years, Grace Community Church had 1,500 members and an annual income of over $2 million. Thomas built a new sanctuary. Started a Christian school. Launched a radio program. He became a name in the community. A leader. Someone important. And the money poured in. But here's what nobody saw. Here's what nobody suspected. Thomas wasn't building a ministry. He was building an extraction machine. A system designed to identify people's vulnerabilities and monetize them. And he was very, very good at it. Let me show you how it worked. Every new member went through a class. New Believers Foundation, it was called. 8 weeks. During those 8 weeks, Thomas or one of his trained staff would interview each person. They called it a spiritual assessment. But the questions weren't about faith. They were about finances. What do you do for work? Are you married? Do you have children? Do you own your home? What does your budget look like? Do you tithe? If not, why not? Most people answered honestly because they trusted the process. They thought it was about helping them grow spiritually. It wasn't. It was about determining their giving capacity. People were categorized. High-capacity donors, those who could give significant amounts, got personal attention from Thomas. He would invite them to lunch. Call them by name. Pray with them privately. He made them feel special. Chosen. And then he would slowly, carefully, introduce them to giving opportunities. Special projects. Mission funds. Building campaigns. He never pressured them directly. He just painted visions. Made them feel like they were part of something bigger. And they gave. Generously. Medium capacity donors, people who could give modestly but consistently, were funneled into small groups and volunteer roles. The goal was integration. Make them so involved, so connected, that leaving would mean losing their entire social structure. Make the church the center of their identity. And once that happened, giving became automatic. Because leaving would cost them everything. Low-capacity donors, people with limited income, were the most valuable. Because they could be convinced to give sacrificially. Thomas preached about the widow's mite constantly. The woman who gave her last 2 coins. He would say, God doesn't want your leftovers, He wants your first fruits. He wants your sacrifice. If you hold back from God, you're robbing Him. And people believed him. Elderly people on fixed incomes. Single mothers working 2 jobs. College students with loans. They gave beyond their means because they were told that faith required it. That breakthrough was on the other side of obedience. That if they didn't give, they were in sin. And Thomas watched it happen. Week after week. Year after year. He watched people sacrifice while he prospered. And he felt nothing. Because by that point, he had convinced himself that he deserved it. That his gift for leadership, his ability to grow the church, his sacrifice of time and energy, earned him the life he was living. He had rationalized every luxury, every hidden account, every manipulative sermon. He wasn't stealing. He was being compensated. And the people weren't victims. They were investors in God's kingdom. At least that's what he told himself. Eleanor Brooks was 73 years old when this story takes place. But to understand why she gave her last $50, you need to understand the 40 years that led up to that moment. Eleanor married young. 19 years old, fresh out of high school, to a man named Robert who worked construction. They were happy. Not wealthy, but happy. They had 3 children. 2 daughters and a son. Robert worked long hours, his hands rough and scarred from years of labor, but he always made it home for dinner. Always tucked the kids into bed. Always told Eleanor he loved her. They went to church because that's what people did. It was a small Methodist church, quiet and predictable, where the same hymns were sung every month and the sermons were gentle and forgettable. Eleanor didn't think much about faith back then. It was just part of life. Like doing laundry or grocery shopping. Something you did because it was what people did. But then Robert got sick. It started with fatigue. Then pain in his joints. Then weight loss. By the time they caught the cancer, it had spread. Pancreatic. Stage 4. The doctors gave him 6 months. He lived for 8. And during those 8 months, Eleanor prayed more than she had in her entire life. She begged God. Bargained with him. Promised him anything if he would just let Robert stay. But Robert didn't stay. He died on a Tuesday morning in October, with Eleanor holding his hand, whispering that she wasn't ready, that she didn't know how to do life without him. And when he took his last breath, something inside Eleanor broke. Not just grief. Terror. Because Robert had been her entire world. And now that world was gone. She didn't know who she was without him. She didn't know how to be alone. The funeral was small. Friends and family, people who said all the right things that meant nothing. I'm so sorry for your loss. He's in a better place. Time heals all wounds. Eleanor nodded and smiled and thanked them. But inside, she was screaming. Because none of it helped. None of it brought him back. None of it made the emptiness less suffocating. 2 weeks after the funeral, a woman from church named Patricia invited Eleanor to a grief support group. It met on Thursday nights at Grace Community Church, a large church across town that Eleanor had never attended. She almost said no. But the silence in her house was unbearable. So she went. The group was small. 6 people, all of whom had lost someone. A widow. A man who lost his daughter. A woman whose husband died by suicide. And Eleanor. They sat in a circle in a small room with fluorescent lights and stale coffee, and they talked. About pain. About anger. About the guilt of being the one who survived. And for the first time since Robert died, Eleanor didn't feel alone. The group was led by a volunteer named Susan, a kind woman in her 50s who had lost her own husband years earlier. But every few weeks, Pastor Thomas Walker would stop by. He never stayed long. Just 10 or 15 minutes. He would sit with them, pray with them, and speak words that felt like they were meant specifically for Eleanor. He talked about purpose in pain. About how God doesn't waste suffering. About how loss can be the doorway to a deeper faith. And Eleanor clung to those words. Because she desperately needed to believe that Robert's death meant something. That her pain had a purpose. That God had a plan. After a few months, Susan suggested Eleanor start attending Sunday services. So she did. And the moment she walked into that sanctuary, she felt something she hadn't felt since Robert died. Hope. The worship was loud and emotional. The preaching was powerful. Pastor Walker spoke with such conviction, such certainty, that Eleanor found herself believing every word. He talked about God's faithfulness, about breakthrough and blessing, about sowing and reaping. And Eleanor thought, maybe this is what I need. Maybe this is how I move forward. She started attending every week. She joined a women's Bible study. She volunteered in the kitchen. And slowly, painfully, she started to rebuild her life. But the life she was building wasn't her own. It was the church's. Every decision she made, she ran through the filter of what Pastor Walker would say. Every dollar she spent, she considered whether it was honoring God. Every relationship she had outside the church started to fade because all her time and energy went to church activities. She didn't notice it happening. It was gradual. But within 2 years of joining Grace Community Church, Eleanor's entire identity was wrapped up in being a faithful member. And that's exactly what Thomas Walker wanted. Because people like Eleanor, people who were grieving, who were lonely, who were searching for meaning, were the easiest to control. They didn't need to be threatened. They needed to be needed. So Thomas made sure Eleanor felt indispensable. He thanked her publicly for her service. He told her she was a blessing to the ministry. He prayed for her by name during services. And every time he did, Eleanor felt seen, valued, important. She would have done anything for that church. And eventually, she did. When Pastor Walker launched a building campaign, Eleanor gave $10,000. It was most of Robert's life insurance. Her daughters begged her not to. They said she needed that money for emergencies, for medical expenses, for the future. But Eleanor didn't listen. Because Pastor Walker had preached a sermon about Abraham sacrificing Isaac. About how God tests our faith by asking for what we love most. And Eleanor believed that giving that money was her test. That if she passed, God would bless her. So she gave. The building was never built. The campaign raised over $1 million, but the project was quietly shelved due to zoning issues, Pastor Walker said. The money, he assured the congregation, would be redirected to other ministry needs. Eleanor never questioned it. Because questioning felt like doubt. And doubt felt like sin. Over the next decade, Eleanor gave regularly. 10% of her Social Security check. $640 a month. Every month. Without fail. Even when her car broke down and she couldn't afford to fix it. Even when her water heater died and she had to boil water on the stove to bathe. Even when her daughter offered to help her with bills and Eleanor refused because she had already committed that money to God. She believed, truly believed, that her faithfulness would be rewarded. That God was keeping track. That one day, all her sacrifice would result in blessing. But the blessing never came. Her health declined. She developed diabetes but couldn't always afford her insulin. She started rationing it, taking less than prescribed, telling herself that faith would make up the difference. Her daughter didn't know. Her friends didn't know. Because Eleanor had learned to hide her struggles. Because admitting need felt like admitting failure. And failure meant she hadn't believed hard enough. So she kept giving. Kept serving. Kept smiling. While inside, she was slowly breaking. And no one noticed. Or if they did, they didn't say anything. Because Eleanor was faithful. And faithful people don't complain. Michael Chen moved to town in the spring of 2019. He was 42, recently divorced, trying to rebuild his life after a marriage that had quietly fallen apart over 15 years. He was a certified public accountant, meticulous and detail-oriented, the kind of person who noticed when numbers didn't add up. He had spent the last 20 years working for a large firm, auditing corporations, ensuring compliance, catching fraud. He was good at his job. Maybe too good. Because he had a hard time turning off the part of his brain that looked for inconsistencies. Even in his personal life. Even in his marriage. His ex-wife used to joke that he audited her emotions. She stopped joking about it the year before she left. Michael knew he wasn't easy to live with. He knew his need for order and logic made him exhausting. But he didn't know how to be different. So when the divorce was finalized, when he found himself alone in a new city with a new job and no connections, he decided to try something he hadn't done in years. He decided to go to church. Not because he was particularly religious. He had grown up going to church, the kind of casual Christianity where you attended on Easter and Christmas and didn't think much about it the rest of the year. But he remembered it being a place where people were kind. Where there was community. And he needed community. So he searched online for churches nearby, and Grace Community Church came up first. 1,500 members. Multiple services. Active ministries. It looked established. Safe. He visited on a Sunday in June. The worship was energetic, the preaching was engaging, and people were friendly. Not overly friendly, which he appreciated. Just warm enough. After the service, a man named Greg approached him. Late 60s, retired, friendly smile. He welcomed Michael, asked if he was new to the area, and invited him to a newcomer's lunch the following week. Michael went. And at that lunch, he met a dozen other people who had recently started attending. Some were young families. Some were college students. A few were older, like Eleanor, who sat quietly in the corner with a cup of coffee and a kind smile. They went around the table introducing themselves, and when it was Michael's turn, he mentioned that he was an accountant. Greg's face lit up. "We could use someone like you," he said. "Our finance committee is always looking for people with financial expertise." Michael wasn't sure he wanted to get that involved. But he also didn't want to say no to the first person who had shown genuine interest in him. So he said yes. And 2 weeks later, he attended his first finance committee meeting. There were 7 people on the committee. Greg, who chaired it. A retired banker named Donald. A small business owner named Karen. A school teacher named Lisa. 2 others whose names Michael immediately forgot. And Pastor Thomas Walker, who sat at the head of the table with a calm, confident presence. The meeting started with prayer. Then Greg handed out a 1-page financial summary. Total income for the month. Total expenses. A modest surplus. Everything looked clean. Simple. Normal. Greg walked through each line item briefly. Tithes and offerings. Salaries. Building maintenance. Ministry expenses. Missions. It took less than 10 minutes. Then he asked if there were any questions. No one spoke. So Greg called for a vote to approve the report. Everyone raised their hand. Including Michael, though he felt a slight discomfort he couldn't quite name. The meeting ended with another prayer, and everyone stood to leave. Michael lingered. He approached Greg and asked casually, "Is there a more detailed breakdown available? I'd love to see the full ledger, just to get a sense of how things are structured." Greg smiled, but something shifted in his eyes. "We keep things pretty streamlined here, Michael. Pastor Walker manages the day-to-day finances, and we trust him to handle the details. This summary is what we review each month." Michael nodded. "Sure, I just meant for my own understanding. I'm used to seeing detailed reports in my work, so." Greg's smile didn't waver, but his tone became firmer. "We've been doing it this way for years, and it works well. If you have concerns, we can discuss them. But I think you'll find that trust is an important part of how we operate here." Michael felt the shift. The subtle but clear message. Don't push. He smiled and said, "No concerns. Just curious." And he left. But the discomfort stayed with him. Because in his experience, when people didn't want you to see the details, it was usually because the details told a different story. Over the next few weeks, Michael started paying attention. Not because he was looking for problems, but because he couldn't help it. It was how his brain worked. He noticed that every few months, Pastor Walker would launch a special campaign. A mission trip that needed funding. A ministry project that required donations. A building repair that was urgent. And every time, the congregation responded generously. Michael watched people give. He saw elderly members writing checks. Young families handing over cash. Single parents contributing even though they looked like they could barely afford it. And he started to wonder. Where was all that money going? The church building was nice, but it wasn't extravagant. The staff was small. The programs, while active, didn't seem expensive. So where was the money? He started doing something he knew he probably shouldn't. He started tracking the campaigns. Writing down the dates, the amounts raised, the stated purposes. And then he started looking for results. A mission trip to Honduras that raised $60,000. He asked people who went how much it cost. They said the flights and accommodations were around $2,000 per person. 15 people went. That's $30,000. Where did the other $30,000 go? A building repair fund that raised $80,000 to fix the roof. Michael drove by the church one Saturday and saw workers on the roof. He stopped and asked the foreman how much the job cost. About $35,000, the man said. Michael thanked him and drove away. His chest felt tight. A youth ministry fund that raised $50,000 for a new recreation space. Michael volunteered with the youth group one Wednesday night and asked the youth pastor when the new space would be ready. The youth pastor looked confused. What new space? Michael's hands went cold. He was starting to see a pattern. And the pattern was clear. Money was coming in. A lot of money. And it wasn't going where people thought it was going. He thought about bringing it up at the next finance committee meeting. But something told him that wouldn't go well. So instead, he did something else. He started investigating on his own. Michael spent 3 months gathering information. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing. He just quietly observed, asked innocent questions, and took notes. He found out that Grace Community Church was structured as a non-profit religious organization, which meant it wasn't required to file public financial disclosures like other nonprofits. Churches operated in a unique legal space. They could accept donations, claim tax-exempt status, and keep their finances almost entirely private. The only people who had access to the full financial picture were the board members and the pastor. And from what Michael could tell, the board wasn't asking questions. He also discovered that Pastor Walker's compensation wasn't just a salary. It was a complex web of allowances and reimbursements. A housing allowance, which is common for pastors and isn't taxed as income. A car allowance. A travel allowance. Book royalties that were processed through the church's publishing account. Conference fees. Ministry expense reimbursements that were vague and frequent. Michael estimated that when you added it all up, Pastor Walker was pulling in well over $300,000 a year. Maybe more. For a church of 1,500 members in a mid-sized town, that was astronomical. But it wasn't illegal. That was the frustrating part. Pastors are allowed to receive compensation. Housing allowances are legal. Reimbursements are standard. As long as the board approved it, as long as the paperwork was filed correctly, there was nothing criminal about it. It was just deeply, profoundly unethical. Because the people giving money had no idea. They thought their pastor lived modestly. They thought their donations were going to ministry. They had no idea they were funding a lifestyle. Michael knew he needed proof. Real proof. Not just suspicions and estimates. So he did something he knew could get him in serious trouble. He accessed the church's financial records without permission. It wasn't hard. The church used a basic accounting software, and Michael had been given a login for his role on the finance committee. His access was supposed to be limited to the summary reports. But he was an accountant. He knew how these systems worked. And with a little digging, he found his way into the full ledger. What he saw made him sick. Over the past 10 years, Grace Community Church had brought in $23 million. Tithes, offerings, special campaigns, book sales, conference fees. Of that $23 million, $12 million had gone to salaries, building costs, and operational expenses. $3 million had gone to actual outreach and ministry. And $8 million had disappeared into a network of LLCs, personal reimbursements, and transfers that all traced back to Pastor Thomas Walker and 3 members of the board, including Greg. Michael found receipts. A boat purchased through a ministry LLC. $53,000. A timeshare in Destin, Florida, listed under a church retreat property. $200,000. Private school tuition for Walker's grandchildren, paid through a youth scholarship fund. $30,000 a year for 3 years. First-class international flights labeled as mission expenses. A luxury SUV lease for Walker's daughter, paid through a staff vehicle program. Michael sat in his home office at 2 in the morning, staring at spreadsheets, and he felt a rage he had never felt before. Because this wasn't just financial mismanagement. This was theft. Calculated, deliberate, systematic theft. From people who trusted. From people who could barely afford it. From people like Eleanor. He thought about going to the board. But 3 of the 7 board members were implicated in the finances. And the others, like Greg, were either complicit or willfully ignorant. He thought about going to the congregation. But who would believe him? Pastor Walker was beloved. Charismatic. Trusted. Michael was new. An outsider. If he made accusations without undeniable proof, he would be dismissed as a troublemaker. Or worse, accused of trying to destroy the church. He thought about going to the authorities. But again, most of what Walker had done was technically legal. Unethical, yes. Immoral, absolutely. But not criminal. Churches operate in a legal gray area, and unless he could prove intentional fraud, which required proving intent to deceive, not just poor stewardship, the authorities wouldn't act. So Michael made a decision. He would go public. Not to the church. Not to the board. But to the media. He contacted a local investigative journalist named Rachel Hartman. She worked for the regional newspaper and had a reputation for holding powerful people accountable. He sent her an encrypted email with a simple message. I have evidence of financial fraud at a local church. Millions of dollars. Are you interested? Rachel responded within an hour. Yes. They met at a coffee shop 2 days later. Michael brought printed copies of everything. Bank statements. Receipts. Transfer records. LLC filings. Rachel looked through the documents carefully, asking questions, taking notes. When she finished, she looked up at Michael. This is bad, she said. Worse than I expected. Michael nodded. Can you do something with it? Rachel hesitated. I can. But you need to understand what's going to happen. If I publish this, your life is going to change. People will accuse you of attacking the church. Of being bitter. Of having an agenda. Some will call you a hero. Others will call you a liar. And Pastor Walker will deny everything. He'll say the finances are complicated, that you don't understand ministry operations, that this is a misunderstanding. Are you ready for that? Michael thought about Eleanor. About the single mothers giving money they didn't have. About the elderly members skipping medications so they could tithe. Yes, he said. I'm ready. Rachel nodded. Then let's do this right. I'm going to need to verify everything. Talk to former staff. Cross-reference documents. This is going to take a few months. Can you be patient? Michael could. Because he knew this wasn't just about exposing one pastor. It was about exposing a system. Rachel spent the next 4 months investigating. She reached out to former staff members who had left Grace Community Church over the years. Some were willing to talk. Others weren't. One former associate pastor, a man named Kevin who had left 3 years earlier, agreed to meet with her. They sat in his living room, and he told her everything. "I loved that church," Kevin said. "I believed in the mission. But the longer I was there, the more I saw things that didn't add up. Money that disappeared. Projects that never happened. And when I asked questions, I was shut down. Pastor Walker told me that questioning leadership was a sign of spiritual immaturity. That I needed to trust and submit. But I couldn't. So I left." Rachel asked if he had documentation. He did. Emails. Meeting notes. Financial records from his time on staff. He handed them over. "I should have done something back then," he said quietly. "But I was afraid. Afraid of being blacklisted. Afraid of losing my reputation. I convinced myself it wasn't my responsibility. But it was. And I've regretted it every day since." Rachel also reached out to current members. Most refused to talk. But a few agreed, under the condition of anonymity. A woman named Jessica told Rachel about the time she and her husband were struggling financially. They had 3 kids, and her husband had lost his job. They were behind on rent and couldn't afford groceries. Jessica went to Pastor Walker for help. He prayed with her. Told her that God would provide. And then he asked if they were tithing. Jessica said they couldn't afford to. Pastor Walker's face changed. He told her that the reason they were struggling was because they weren't honoring God with their finances. That if they would step out in faith and tithe, even when it didn't make sense, God would open the windows of heaven and pour out blessing. Jessica left that meeting feeling ashamed. Guilty. Like their poverty was her fault. So she and her husband started tithing again. 10% of unemployment benefits. Money they desperately needed for food. And their situation didn't improve. It got worse. They were evicted 3 months later. And when Jessica reached out to the church for help, she was told that the benevolence fund was depleted. There was nothing available. Jessica and her husband left the church. And the faith they once had never fully recovered. Another man, a retired veteran named Robert, told Rachel about the time he donated $20,000 to a mission project in Uganda. Pastor Walker had shown photos of an orphanage that needed clean water. Robert, who had served in the military and had a heart for helping kids, gave everything he had saved. 6 months later, Robert was talking to a missionary who worked in Uganda. He mentioned the orphanage project. The missionary had never heard of it. Robert asked Pastor Walker about it. Walker said the project had been delayed due to government issues, but the money was being held in a designated account. Robert asked to see the account. Walker said that information was confidential. Robert pushed. And he was asked to leave the church. Not formally. Not publicly. But he was suddenly excluded from leadership meetings. His calls weren't returned. He got the message. Robert never saw his money again. And he never stepped foot in another church. Rachel verified every story. She cross-referenced dates, checked records, and found patterns. And the pattern was always the same. People gave in good faith. Their money disappeared. And when they asked questions, they were silenced, shamed, or pushed out. Rachel also did something crucial. She tracked down property records. And that's where she found the smoking gun. Pastor Thomas Walker owned 3 properties. His primary residence, a 4,000 square foot home in an upscale neighborhood, valued at $650,000. A lake house in the mountains, valued at $400,000, registered under his wife's maiden name. And a condo in Florida, valued at $300,000, owned through an LLC called Shepherd's Rest Properties. Rachel traced the LLC back to the church. Shepherd's Rest Properties had been established by Grace Community Church as a retreat property for staff and missionaries. But there was no record of it ever being used for that purpose. The only person who stayed there, according to neighbors Rachel interviewed, was Pastor Walker and his family. Twice a year. For vacation. Rachel now had everything she needed. Financial documents. Testimonies. Property records. A clear pattern of deception. She reached out to Pastor Walker for comment. She sent him a detailed list of questions via email and gave him 2 weeks to respond. He didn't respond to the email. But he did respond from the pulpit. The next Sunday, Pastor Walker preached a sermon about spiritual warfare. About how the enemy attacks churches that are doing God's work. About how lies and accusations are tools of the devil. He didn't mention Rachel by name. But the message was clear. He was preparing his congregation. Telling them that anything they might hear was an attack. And they believed him. Because they had been trained to believe him. For years, he had conditioned them to see questioning as doubt, and doubt as sin. So when Rachel's article was published 3 weeks later, the congregation was already primed to reject it. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Because what happens next is going to test everything you thought you knew about faith, trust, and the institutions we give power to. And I need to know you're ready for it. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Hit that button. Turn on notifications. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this don't get told often enough. And the only way they reach people is if you help spread them. Alright. Let's continue. The article was published on a Thursday morning. The headline read, "Local megachurch pastor accused of financial misconduct, millions unaccounted for." Rachel's reporting was thorough, detailed, and damning. She laid out the finances. The properties. The testimonies. The pattern of manipulation and control. She included copies of documents, screenshots of financial records, and quotes from former staff. She also included a statement from Michael, who had agreed to go on record. "I didn't want to believe it," Michael said in the article. "I wanted to think there was an explanation. But the numbers don't lie. And the people who have been hurt deserve the truth." The article went viral. Within hours, it was shared thousands of times on social media. Local news stations picked it up. National outlets reached out to Rachel for interviews. And Grace Community Church was thrust into the spotlight in a way it had never been before. The response from the congregation was split. Some people were horrified. They read the article, saw the evidence, and felt betrayed. They reached out to Rachel. They thanked Michael. They said they had suspected something was wrong but didn't know how to articulate it. Others were defensive. They called the article a hit piece. They accused Rachel of bias. They said Michael was a disgruntled member with an axe to grind. They organized prayer meetings to pray against the attack on their church. And Pastor Walker, to his credit, played his role perfectly. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He addressed the allegations head-on. That Sunday, the church was packed. Not just with regular members, but with reporters, protesters, and curiosity seekers. People held signs outside. Some said, "Where did our money go?" Others said, "Stand with Pastor Walker." The parking lot was chaos. Inside, the sanctuary was tense. You could feel it in the air. The uncertainty. The fear. The anger. Pastor Walker walked onto the stage with his usual calm confidence. He stood at the pulpit, looked out at the congregation, and smiled. Not a defensive smile, A sad, disappointed smile. Like a father who had been wrongly accused by his children. I want to address the article that was published this week, he began. His voice was steady. Measured. I want to address the lies that have been spread about this ministry, about me, and about the work we do here. He paused. Let the word lies hang in the air. First, I want to say that I understand why some people might be confused. Church finances are complicated. And when you don't understand something, it's easy to misinterpret it. But let me be very clear. Every dollar that comes into this church is accounted for. Every expense is documented. Every decision is made with the oversight of our board. And every penny is used to advance the kingdom of God. The congregation erupted in applause. Amens echoed through the room. Pastor Walker raised his hand for silence. Now, I'm not going to go through every accusation point by point. Because that would give credibility to something that doesn't deserve it. But I will say this. The properties that were mentioned in that article. The home I live in was purchased with my salary, which I earned through decades of faithful service. The lake house belongs to my wife's family. It's been in her family for 30 years. And the Florida property is a legitimate ministry resource that has been used by staff and missionaries, though I'll admit we haven't kept the best records of who used it when. That's on me. We can do better. He paused again. His eyes glistened. Real tears. Or maybe just practiced ones. Michael, sitting in the back row, couldn't tell anymore. But what hurts the most, Walker continued, his voice breaking slightly, is not the false accusations. It's the fact that someone I welcomed into this church, someone I trusted, someone I invited into leadership, would go behind my back and try to destroy everything we've built here. Michael Chen sat in our finance meetings. He had access to the same information everyone else had. And instead of coming to me with questions, instead of approaching this with humility and grace, he went to the media. He took private church matters and made them public. And that tells me everything I need to know about his character and his motives. The congregation turned. Hundreds of eyes found Michael in the back row. Some looked confused. Others looked angry. Michael felt his chest tighten. This was exactly what Rachel had warned him about. He would become the villain. The troublemaker. The one who attacked God's anointed. Eleanor sat in her usual spot, third row, right side. She listened to Pastor Walker's words. She wanted to believe him. She had spent 13 years trusting him, following him, giving to him. But something felt different this time. Something felt wrong. Because she had read the article. She had seen the documents. She had seen the numbers. And the numbers didn't lie. She thought about the building campaign she had contributed to. The $10,000 from Robert's life insurance. The building that was never built. Pastor Walker had said it was zoning issues. But the article said there were no zoning issues. The article said the money had gone somewhere else. Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap. She didn't know what to believe anymore. And that terrified her. Because if she couldn't trust Pastor Walker, if she couldn't trust the church, then what did she have left? Pastor Walker continued. I want to invite anyone who has questions to come talk to me personally. My door is always open. I have nothing to hide. And I want to invite Michael Chen, if he's here today, to come forward right now. Let's talk about this like men of God. Let's resolve this in the light, not in the shadows. Michael didn't move. Because he knew this wasn't an invitation. It was a trap. A public spectacle designed to make him look like a coward if he stayed silent or a fool if he spoke. But then something unexpected happened. Eleanor stood up. Slowly. Her legs shook. Her heart pounded. But she stood. And she spoke. Her voice was quiet at first. Barely audible. Pastor Walker, I have a question. The room went silent. Everyone turned to look at her. Pastor Walker's smile didn't falter, but something flickered in his eyes. Of course, Sister Eleanor. What's your question? Eleanor swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry. The building campaign. The one from 10 years ago. The one I gave to. Where did that money go? Pastor Walker's face softened. Sympathetic. Understanding. Sister Eleanor, as I mentioned earlier, that project was delayed due to circumstances beyond our control. The money was redirected to other ministry needs. It's all documented in our financial records. Eleanor nodded slowly. Can I see those records? The question hung in the air like a grenade. Pastor Walker's smile tightened. Eleanor, I don't think this is the time or place. I just want to see where my money went, Eleanor said, her voice stronger now. I gave $10,000. My husband's life insurance. I just want to know where it went. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Other people were nodding. Whispering. Eleanor wasn't the only one who wanted answers. Pastor Walker's expression shifted. The warmth was gone. In its place was something cold. Controlled. Eleanor, if you have questions about your giving, we can schedule a private meeting. But I'm not going to turn this service into an interrogation based on false accusations from a man who clearly has an agenda. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. Not sad tears. Angry tears. I read the article, Pastor. I saw the houses. The boat. The expenses. And I just want to know. Did my money pay for any of that? The room exploded. Some people gasped. Others shouted. How dare you? Sister Eleanor, that's out of line. This is an attack on God's anointed. But others were silent. Watching. Waiting. Because they wanted to know too. Michael stood up. His heart was racing, but his voice was calm. Pastor Walker, I'll come forward. Let's talk about this right now. In front of everyone. Let's go through the finances together. Line by line. I have the records. You have the records. Let's put them side by side and see if they match. Pastor Walker's face went pale. For the first time, he looked rattled. This is not appropriate. This is a house of worship, not a courtroom. Then let's go to a courtroom, Michael said. Let's bring in an independent auditor. Let's open the books to the entire congregation. If everything is as you say, if every dollar is accounted for, then you have nothing to hide. Right? The silence was deafening. Pastor Walker stood at the pulpit, his hands gripping the edges, his knuckles white. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. And then he said the words that sealed his fate. I don't have to justify myself to you or anyone else in this room. I answer to God. And if you don't like how this church is run, you're free to leave. The room erupted. Half the congregation was on their feet, shouting, some in support of Walker, others in outrage. People were crying. Arguing. Eleanor sat back down, her hands covering her face. She felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. Because she had just heard her pastor, the man she had trusted for 13 years, tell her that her questions didn't matter. That her sacrifice didn't matter. That she didn't matter. And in that moment, something inside her broke. Not her faith. But her willingness to let someone else control it. Michael walked out. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't argue. He just left. And as he walked through the lobby, past the protesters and the reporters, he felt a strange sense of peace. Because he had done what he came to do. He had told the truth. And now the congregation had a choice. Believe the truth. Or keep believing the lie. Over the next 3 days, over 400 members left Grace Community Church. Some left quietly. Others left loudly, demanding refunds, threatening lawsuits, writing scathing posts on social media. The media coverage intensified. Rachel published a follow-up article with more testimonies, more documents, more evidence. And slowly, painfully, the walls that Thomas Walker had built around himself began to crumble. The board called an emergency meeting. Greg, the chairman, tried to control the narrative. But 3 of the 7 board members resigned. They released a statement saying they had been unaware of the full scope of the financial discrepancies and could no longer in good conscience serve in leadership. The remaining members, including Greg, doubled down. They stood by Pastor Walker. They said the accusations were overblown, that the media was biased, that the church was under attack. But it didn't matter. Because the damage was done. The trust was broken. And once trust is broken, it's almost impossible to rebuild. 2 weeks after the article was published, Rachel received an anonymous email. It contained a single attachment. A PDF file. The subject line read, "You need to see this." Rachel opened it. It was a training manual. 73 pages. Titled, "Building a Sustainable Ministry, a Strategic Guide for Church Growth." The author was listed as Dr. Thomas Walker. Rachel's hands shook as she scrolled through it. Because what she was reading wasn't a spiritual guide. It was a business plan. A blueprint for exploitation. The manual was divided into sections. Section 1 was called, "Identifying High-Value Members." It taught pastors how to profile their congregation. How to identify people who were vulnerable, lonely, grieving, or financially comfortable. It provided sample questions to ask during new member interviews. Questions designed to extract personal information under the guise of spiritual care. What are your biggest fears? What keeps you up at night? Have you experienced significant loss? Do you struggle with guilt or shame? The manual explained that these questions helped pastors understand emotional triggers that could be leveraged during sermons and appeals. Section 2 was called, "Creating Dependency." It outlined strategies for making members feel like the church was essential to their identity. Encourage involvement in multiple ministries. Make them too busy to build relationships outside the church. Use language that equates leaving the church with leaving God. Create an us versus them mentality where the church is safe and the world is dangerous. The manual even included sample sermon outlines designed to reinforce this message. The danger of isolation. Why you need the body of Christ. Protecting yourself from worldly influence. Each sermon was crafted to make people feel like they couldn't survive spiritually without the church. Section 3 was called, "Maximizing Giving." This section was the most disturbing. It provided detailed psychological tactics for increasing donations. Use urgency and scarcity. Create campaigns with deadlines. Make people feel like they'll miss out on blessing if they don't give immediately. Use social proof. Publicly recognize generous givers. Make others feel like they need to keep up. Use guilt and fear. Remind people that withholding from God has consequences. Teach that financial struggle is the result of disobedience. The manual included scripts. Actual word-for-word scripts that pastors could use during offering appeals. God is looking for people who will trust Him with everything. Will you be one of those people? Or will you hold back and miss what He wants to do in your life? Section 4 was called, "Handling Dissent." This section explained how to deal with members who ask questions or push back. Isolate them. Don't engage publicly. Take them aside privately and reframe their questions as spiritual issues. It sounds like you're struggling with trust. Let's pray about that. If they persist, marginalize them. Exclude them from leadership. Reduce their involvement. Make them feel like they're the problem. If they still won't comply, remove them. Not publicly. Quietly. Stop returning their calls. Stop including them in communications. Make them feel unwelcome until they leave on their own. The manual called this natural attrition. Rachel felt sick. Because this wasn't just Thomas Walker. This was a system. A teachable, replicable system. And if Walker had created a manual, that meant he had taught this to others. She scrolled to the final section. It was called Building Your Network. And it included a list. Names. Email addresses. Pastors Walker had consulted with or trained. Over 200 names. Churches in 34 states. Some were small. Some were megachurches with thousands of members. Rachel stared at the list. And she realized that what was happening at Grace Community Church wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern. A system of spiritual and financial abuse that was being taught, refined, and spread across the country. She reached out to Michael. Showed him the manual. His face went gray. "This is worse than I thought," he said quietly. "This isn't just fraud. This is organized exploitation." Rachel nodded. "I'm going to publish this. But I need to contact some of these other churches first. See if the pattern holds." Over the next month, Rachel contacted 20 of the churches on the list. 16 refused to comment. 3 threatened legal action if she published anything about them. But one pastor agreed to talk. His name was David Moreno. He was 47, and he had attended one of Thomas Walker's training seminars 5 years earlier. He had implemented some of the strategies. And he had hated himself for it. "I was desperate," David told Rachel over the phone. "My church was dying. 50 members, most of them elderly. I thought if I could just grow the church, if I could just get people in the door, then I could do real ministry. So I went to Walker's seminar. And he promised results. He said if I followed his system, I'd double my congregation in 2 years. And he was right. I did. But the cost was my soul." David explained that he had started using the tactics. Profiling members. Creating dependency. Manipulating giving. And it worked. The church grew. Money came in. But David started noticing something. People weren't growing spiritually. They were just becoming more compliant. More controlled. More afraid. "I had created a culture of fear," David said, his voice breaking. "People were afraid to question me. Afraid to miss a service. Afraid to stop giving. And I realized I wasn't a pastor anymore. I was a puppet master. So I stopped. I confessed to my congregation. I told them what I had done. Half of them left. The other half stayed. And we started over. From scratch. With honesty this time." Rachel asked if she could share his story. David agreed. "If it helps even one pastor avoid the trap I fell into, it's worth it." Rachel published a follow-up article. This time, the headline read, "Megachurch Pastors Training Manual Reveals Systematic Exploitation, Hundreds of Churches Potentially Affected." The article included excerpts from the manual. Testimony from David Moreno. And a call for other pastors and churches to come forward. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, Rachel received over 100 emails. Some from pastors who had attended Walker's seminars and were now regretting it. Others from church members who recognized the tactics and realized they had been manipulated. A few from denominational leaders who wanted to investigate further. The story went national. Major news outlets picked it up. 60 Minutes reached out to Rachel for an interview. Congressional representatives started asking questions about church financial accountability. And Thomas Walker, for the first time in his life, had nowhere to hide. Grace Community Church officially closed 4 months after the initial article was published. Not because it was forced to, but because it bled out. Membership dropped from 1,500 to less than 200. Giving plummeted. Staff resigned. The building went into foreclosure. And on a cold Sunday morning in February, the doors were locked for the final time. Thomas Walker resigned 6 weeks before the closure. He released a brief statement through his lawyer. It said he was stepping down to focus on his family and his health. It did not admit wrongdoing. It did not apologize. It simply said he was moving on. He and his wife relocated to Arizona. He did not face criminal charges. Because, as multiple attorneys explained to Rachel and Michael, most of what he did was not illegal. Unethical, yes. Immoral, absolutely. But not criminal. Churches operate under different rules than other nonprofits. They're not required to disclose finances publicly. They're not subject to the same oversight. And unless prosecutors can prove intentional fraud, which requires proving that Walker deliberately deceived people with the intent to steal, rather than just engaged in poor stewardship or self-serving financial decisions, there's no case. It's a legal gray area. And Walker had operated carefully within that gray area for decades. Michael struggled with that reality. He had spent months exposing the truth, risking his reputation, his safety, his peace of mind. And the man responsible faced no real consequences. How is that justice? Michael asked Rachel one afternoon over coffee. They had become friends through this process. Allies. Rachel sighed. It's not. But that's the system. Churches have more legal protection than almost any other institution. And until that changes, people like Walker will keep doing what they do. Michael stared into his coffee. So what do we do? Rachel smiled sadly. We keep telling the truth. We keep shining light. And we hope that enough people wake up that the system has to change. Michael nodded. But it didn't feel like enough. He had wanted justice. Real justice. Accountability. Restitution. But what he got was awareness. And he had to accept that sometimes, awareness is all you get. He started a nonprofit 6 months later. He called it Church Financial Transparency Initiative. Its mission was simple: help congregations demand accountability from their leadership. Provide resources for identifying financial red flags. Offer training for church boards on proper oversight. And advocate for legislative change that would require churches to disclose their finances publicly, the same way other nonprofits do. The work was slow. Frustrating. Most churches didn't want his help. They saw him as a troublemaker. A church hater. Someone who wanted to destroy ministry. But a few reached out. Small churches. Mid-sized churches. Even a couple of larger ones who had seen what happened at Grace Community and didn't want to end up the same way. Michael trained their boards. Helped them set up proper financial controls. Taught them how to ask the right questions. And slowly, painfully, he started to see change. Not everywhere. Not even in most places. But in a few places. And that was something. Eleanor never went back to church. Not to Grace Community. Not to any church. She tried. 3 different times over the course of a year, she visited different churches. Small ones. Different denominations. Places that seemed safe. But every time she sat in a pew, every time the offering plate came around, every time the pastor stood up to preach, she felt her chest tighten. She felt the old fear creep in. The fear of being manipulated. The fear of being used. The fear that she was being lied to again. So she stopped trying. And for a long time, she felt guilty about that. Because she had been taught her entire life that not going to church meant you were backsliding. That you couldn't be a faithful Christian outside of a church building. That forsaking the assembly was a sin. But then she started reading her Bible differently. Without a pastor's interpretation. Without a sermon telling her what it meant. Just her and the text. And she discovered something that surprised her. Jesus spent very little time in religious buildings. He was in the streets. In people's homes. On mountainsides. At wells. In the mess of real life. He didn't tell people to build institutions. He told them to love God and love people. That was it. 2 commands. Everything else was commentary. Eleanor started meeting with 3 other women who had left Grace Community Church. They met every Tuesday morning at a coffee shop. They talked. Prayed. Read scripture together. Argued about what verses meant. Laughed. Cried. And for the first time in Eleanor's life, faith felt honest. Messy. Real. Human. She realized that for decades, she had outsourced her faith to someone else. She had let a pastor tell her what to believe, how to believe, when to believe. She had given her faith away. And now, she was taking it back. It wasn't easy. Some days she missed the certainty. The structure. The feeling of being part of something big. But most days, she felt free. Free to question. Free to doubt. Free to believe on her own terms. And that freedom, uncomfortable as it sometimes was, felt more sacred than any church service she had ever attended. 2 years after the scandal, Rachel published a book. It was called The Cost of Faith: How Churches Exploit Believers and What We Can Do About It. It wasn't just about Thomas Walker or Grace Community Church. It was about the system. The legal structures that allow churches to operate without transparency. The psychological tactics that manipulate vulnerable people. The cultural norms that equate questioning with faithlessness. And the stories. Dozens of stories from people across the country who had experienced similar situations. People who had given everything to churches that took everything and gave nothing back. People who had been spiritually abused, financially exploited, emotionally manipulated. People who had lost their faith not because they stopped believing in God, but because they stopped believing in the institution that claimed to represent Him. The book became a bestseller. Not because it was sensational, but because it was true. And people were hungry for the truth. Rachel did interviews, podcasts, speaking engagements. And everywhere she went, people approached her with their own stories. This happened to me. I thought I was the only one. Thank you for saying what I couldn't say. The conversations were painful. But they were also healing. Because for many people, being heard was the first step toward recovery. Michael was interviewed for the book. He talked about what he had learned through the process. I used to think the problem was bad pastors, he said. Individual bad actors who abused their power. But it's bigger than that. It's a system that gives pastors too much power and too little accountability. It's a culture that tells people to trust without verifying. To give without questioning. To obey without thinking. And until we change that culture, this will keep happening. He also talked about the cost. I lost friends over this. People I thought cared about me called me a wolf. A deceiver. An enemy of the church. I got death threats. People showed up at my house. My car was vandalized. And for a long time, I wondered if it was worth it. But then I think about Eleanor. I think about the single mothers who were guilted into giving money they didn't have. I think about the elderly members who went without medication so they could tithe. And I know it was worth it. Because their stories matter. And someone had to tell them. Eleanor was also interviewed. She talked about her journey. About the grief of losing not just a church, but an entire identity. I didn't know who I was without that church, she said. For 13 years, my entire life revolved around it. My schedule. My friendships. My purpose. And when it all fell apart, I felt like I had lost everything. But I hadn't. I had just lost the illusion. And once the illusion was gone, I could finally see what was real. She talked about the women she met with every Tuesday. About how they had become her new faith community. We don't have a building. We don't have a pastor. We don't have programs or budgets or mission statements. We just have each other. And we have the freedom to seek God honestly. To ask hard questions. To admit when we don't know. To change our minds. To grow. And that feels more like church than anything I experienced in a building. She also talked about forgiveness. People ask me if I've forgiven Pastor Walker. And I don't know how to answer that. Because forgiveness doesn't mean pretending he didn't hurt me. It doesn't mean saying what he did was okay. It doesn't mean I trust him or want him in my life. For me, forgiveness means I'm not going to let what he did define the rest of my life. I'm not going to stay stuck in bitterness. I'm not going to give him that power. So yes, I've forgiven him. But that doesn't mean I've forgotten. And it doesn't mean I think he should get away with it. Rachel asked her what she would say to people who are still in churches like Grace Community. People who suspect something is wrong but are afraid to ask questions. Eleanor thought for a long time before answering. I would say, trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And asking questions doesn't make you a bad Christian. It makes you a wise one. Don't let anyone tell you that doubt is sin. Doubt is how we get to truth. And truth is what sets us free. Thomas Walker never gave an interview. He never publicly responded to the book or the articles or the accusations. He maintained his silence. But Rachel tracked him down anyway. She found out that he was consulting for a church in Scottsdale, Arizona. A growing church with about 800 members. She contacted the pastor, a man named Eric, and asked if he knew about Walker's history. Eric said he did. Thomas made mistakes, Eric told Rachel. But he's repented. He's learned from them. And I believe in second chances. Rachel asked if the congregation knew. Eric hesitated. Some do. But we're not going to make it a big issue. We're focused on moving forward, not dwelling on the past. Rachel published that conversation. And within a week, half of Eric's congregation left. The church released a statement saying Thomas Walker was no longer affiliated with them. And once again, Walker disappeared. Rachel sometimes wondered where he was. If he ever felt remorse. If he ever lay awake at night thinking about the people he hurt. She doubted it. Because people like Walker don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as victims. Misunderstood. Persecuted. Attacked by people who just don't understand how ministry works. And that, Rachel realized, was the scariest part. Because it meant he would do it again. Maybe not in the same way. Maybe not in the same place. But somewhere. To someone. Because the system allowed it. And until the system changed, men like Thomas Walker would always find a place to hide. 3 years after Grace Community Church closed, the building was purchased by a non-profit organization that converted it into a community center. They kept the sanctuary but removed the religious symbols. They turned the Sunday school rooms into classrooms for after-school programs. They transformed the fellowship hall into a food bank distribution center. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The building that had once extracted resources from the community was now giving back. Michael attended the grand opening. He walked through the halls, remembering the finance committee meetings, the confrontation with Greg, the Sunday everything exploded. It felt like a lifetime ago. He ran into Eleanor there. She was volunteering at the food bank. They hugged. "How are you?" Michael asked. Eleanor smiled. A real smile. Not the performance smile she used to wear at church. "I'm good. Really good. I'm volunteering here twice a week. I'm spending time with my grandkids. I'm reading books I never had time to read before. And I'm okay. I'm actually okay." Michael felt relief wash over him. Because he had worried about her. Wondered if exposing the truth had done more harm than good. If it had destroyed her faith completely. But looking at her now, he could see that it hadn't. It had freed her. They talked for a while. About their lives. About the changes they'd seen. About the churches that had reached out to Michael's organization asking for help. About the pastors who had confessed to using manipulative tactics and were trying to do better. "Do you think things are changing?" Eleanor asked. Michael considered the question. "In some places, yes. In others, no. But I think the conversation is changing. People are asking questions they didn't ask before. They're demanding transparency they didn't demand before. And that's something." Eleanor nodded. "I heard Pastor Walker is in Texas now. Working with another church." Michael had heard the same thing. It made him angry. Frustrated. But he had learned that he couldn't control what Walker did. He could only control what he did. "Yeah. I heard that too. I reached out to the church. Tried to warn them. They thanked me for my concern and told me they were praying about it. Which basically means they're going to ignore it." Eleanor sighed. "Some people have to learn the hard way." "Yeah. Unfortunately." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Eleanor said, "You know what's strange? I don't hate him anymore. I used to. For a long time, I was so angry I couldn't think about anything else. But now, I just feel sad for him. Because he spent his whole life building something that wasn't real. And when it all came crashing down, he had nothing left. No real relationships. No real faith. Just a reputation in ruins and a list of people he hurt. That's a terrible legacy." Michael hadn't thought about it that way. But she was right. In trying to protect himself, Walker had destroyed himself. "Do you ever miss it?" Michael asked. "Church, I mean. The way it used to be." Eleanor thought about it. "I miss the idea of it. The sense of belonging. The feeling that you're part of something bigger. But I don't miss the reality. Because the reality was control disguised as community. And I'd rather be free and lonely than trapped and surrounded." Michael understood. He had felt the same way. He had visited a few churches since leaving Grace Community. Some were better. Some were worse. But he always left feeling uneasy. Like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Waiting to see the manipulation. The control. The exploitation. "Maybe that's the cost," Michael said. "Once you see it, you can't unsee it." Eleanor nodded. "Yeah. But maybe that's okay. Maybe seeing clearly is worth the discomfort." Before they parted ways, Eleanor said something that stuck with Michael. "You know, I think God was never in that building. I think he was in the questions. In the courage it took to ask them. In the people who stood up when it would have been easier to sit down. That's where I saw God. Not in the sermons. Not in the worship. But in the truth. Even when it hurt." Michael thought about that on his drive home. And he realized she was right. The most sacred moments of the past few years hadn't happened in church services. They had happened in coffee shops. In living rooms. In late-night phone calls with people who were trying to make sense of what had happened to them. In emails from pastors who wanted to do better. In conversations with congregants who were learning to ask questions. That's where he had encountered something real. Something honest. Something that felt like faith should feel. Messy and uncertain and deeply, profoundly human. And maybe, he thought, that was the point. Maybe faith was never supposed to be controlled. Maybe it was always supposed to be free. Free to question. Free to doubt. Free to grow. Free to change. Free to fail. Free to start over. And maybe the greatest act of faith wasn't obedience. Maybe it was courage. The courage to walk away from institutions that demand your submission. The courage to ask questions that might not have easy answers. The courage to rebuild your faith from the ground up, brick by brick, doubt by doubt, truth by truth. Until you find something real. Something honest. Something worth believing in. The story of Grace Community Church is not unique. Similar stories have played out in churches across the country. Different names. Different details. But the same pattern. Charismatic leaders who build empires on the backs of trusting people. Systems designed to extract resources and control behavior. Cultures that equate questioning with faithlessness. And victims who are left to pick up the pieces when it all falls apart. But here's what's important to understand. This is not a story about Christianity being false. This is a story about institutions being broken. There are churches doing good work. Pastors who serve with integrity. Communities that practice transparency and accountability. They exist. But they're harder to find than they should be. Because the system doesn't require them to exist. The system allows corruption. It protects abusers. It prioritizes reputation over truth. And until that changes, stories like this will keep happening. So what can you do? If you're in a church, ask questions. Real questions. Where does the money go? Who has access to the financial records? Is there independent oversight? How are leaders held accountable? Are dissenting voices welcomed or silenced? If you don't get clear answers, that's a red flag. If you're told that asking questions shows a lack of faith, that's a bigger red flag. If you're made to feel guilty for wanting transparency, run. Because healthy institutions welcome questions. They embrace accountability. They understand that trust must be earned, not demanded. If you've been hurt by a church, know that your pain is valid. What happened to you was wrong. It wasn't your fault. And leaving wasn't a failure. It was survival. Your faith doesn't have to look like anyone else's. It doesn't have to happen in a building. It doesn't have to involve a pastor. It doesn't have to follow a formula. Faith is between you and whatever you believe is sacred. And no one, no matter their title or position, has the right to control that. If you're a pastor or church leader watching this, please hear this. The power you hold is immense. People trust you with their money, their time, their hearts, their faith. Don't abuse that trust. Be transparent. Be humble. Welcome questions. Embrace accountability. And remember that your calling is to serve, not to be served. The moment you start believing you're entitled to special treatment, the moment you start justifying decisions that benefit you at the expense of others, the moment you start silencing dissent instead of engaging with it, you've lost your way. And you'll leave a trail of broken people behind you. Is that really the legacy you want? This story is about more than one church. It's about a reckoning. A reckoning with the way we've structured faith. The way we've given power to individuals without requiring accountability. The way we've confused obedience with faithfulness. The way we've built institutions that benefit leaders at the expense of followers. And the way we've stayed silent when we should have spoken up. Eleanor gave her last $50. And it almost killed her. Not physically, though it could have. But spiritually. Emotionally. Psychologically. She gave everything because she was told that's what faith required. And she almost lost herself in the process. But she didn't. Because she found the courage to ask questions. To demand answers. To walk away when the answers didn't come. And in walking away, she found something she had lost years before. Herself. Her voice. Her faith. Not the faith she was sold. But the faith she discovered. And that faith, hard-won and honestly sought, was more real than anything she had experienced in 40 years of church attendance. So here's the question you need to ask yourself. If you discovered tomorrow that your church, the church you attend, the church you give to, the church you trust, was hiding something, would you want to know? Or would you rather not ask? Because that choice, that single choice, determines everything. Ignorance feels safe. But it's not. Truth feels dangerous. But it's not. Truth is the only solid ground. Everything else is sinking sand. And you can either build your faith on truth, with all its discomfort and uncertainty. Or you can build it on lies, with all its false comfort and inevitable collapse. The choice is yours. But make it consciously. Make it honestly. Because your faith, your real faith, depends on it. If you made it this far, I need you to do something. Don't just watch this and move on. Share it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who's questioning their church. Share it with someone who's been hurt and thinks they're alone. Share it with someone who's in leadership and needs a wake-up call. Because this story, as painful as it is, needs to be told. And it needs to be heard. Drop a comment right now and tell me, what was your biggest takeaway from this story? What shocked you the most? And if you've experienced something similar, if you've been manipulated by a church or religious leader, I want you to know that you're not alone. Your story matters. Your pain is real. And you deserve better. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because we're not done telling these stories. There are more truths that need to come to light. More systems that need to be challenged. More people who need to know they're not crazy for asking questions. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And if this story helped you in any way, if it gave you permission to ask the questions you've been afraid to ask, if it made you feel less alone, leave a like. Because that tells me this work matters. That telling these hard truths is worth it. Share this video everywhere. Facebook. Twitter. Reddit. Send it in group chats. Email it to friends. Because the only way change happens is when enough people wake up and refuse to accept things as they are. And one more thing. If you're a pastor or church leader watching this and you feel defensive, I want you to sit with that feeling. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself if there's truth in this story that applies to you. Ask yourself if you're truly serving or if you've started to be served. Because the greatest act of leadership isn't defending your position. It's having the humility to examine it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for having the courage to hear a story that a lot of people would rather ignore. Now let me ask you one final question, and I want you to really think about it. After everything you've heard, after every detail, every revelation, every painful truth, would you still walk into a church the same way you did before? Or has something fundamentally changed in how you see the institution? Because that's the real question this story asks. Not whether God exists. Not whether faith matters. But whether the buildings we've constructed, the systems we've created, the leaders we've empowered, are actually serving the faith they claim to represent. Or if they've become something else entirely. Something that looks like faith but functions like control. Something that sounds like love but feels like manipulation. Something that promises freedom but delivers bondage. Think about that. Sit with it. And then decide what you're going to do about it. Because silence is a choice. And so is speaking up. 5 years after the scandal, Michael received an email. It was from a woman named Sarah. She was 34, a single mother of 2, and she had been attending a church in Tennessee. She had read Rachel's book. She had watched Michael's interviews. And she had started noticing patterns in her own church. Money that didn't add up. Campaigns that raised funds for projects that never materialized. A pastor who preached about sacrifice while driving a car worth more than her annual salary. She had started asking questions. And she had been told, politely but firmly, that her questions were unwelcome. That she needed to trust leadership. That questioning was a sign of spiritual immaturity. So she left. And now she was writing to Michael, thanking him. Because his story had given her permission to trust her instincts. To ask the hard questions. To walk away when the answers didn't come. I thought I was going crazy, she wrote. Everyone around me seemed fine with it. And I kept thinking, maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I'm too critical. Maybe I don't understand how church finances work. But your story helped me see that I wasn't crazy. I was awake. And being awake is scary. But it's better than being asleep. Michael read the email 3 times. And then he saved it in a folder he kept for moments when the work felt too hard, when he wondered if any of it mattered, when he questioned whether he had done the right thing. Because emails like Sarah's reminded him why he started this work in the first place. Not to destroy churches. But to protect people. To give them the tools to recognize manipulation. To empower them to demand accountability. To let them know that asking questions wasn't a sign of weak faith. It was a sign of strong faith. Eleanor received letters too. From women all over the country who had read about her story in Rachel's book. Women who had given their last dollars to churches that promised blessing but delivered nothing. Women who had been widowed, divorced, abandoned, and found themselves in churches that preached about God's provision while extracting everything they had left. Women who had felt guilty for being angry, ashamed for doubting, afraid of what leaving would mean. And Eleanor wrote back to every single one. She told them about her Tuesday morning coffee group. About how they had created their own community, messy and imperfect, but honest. About how faith didn't require a building or a pastor or a program. About how the most sacred thing they could do was honor their own voice, their own questions, their own journey. You don't owe anyone your faith, Eleanor wrote to a woman named Margaret who was struggling with whether to leave her church. Your faith is between you and God. No one else gets a vote. Not your pastor. Not your friends. Not your family. Just you and God. And if a church makes you feel small, afraid, or controlled, that's not God. That's something else. And you have permission to walk away. Margaret wrote back 2 weeks later. She had left her church. And for the first time in years, she said, she felt like she could breathe. Rachel continued her investigative work. She published more articles about church financial abuse. She testified before state legislatures about the need for greater accountability and transparency. She consulted with nonprofits working to protect vulnerable people from spiritual manipulation. And she never stopped telling stories. Because she had learned that stories were the most powerful tool she had. Numbers and data mattered. Laws and policies mattered. But stories, human stories with names and faces and pain and hope, those were what changed hearts. And changed hearts were what led to changed systems. She thought about Thomas Walker sometimes. Wondered if he ever felt regret. Wondered if he ever lay awake at night haunted by the faces of the people he hurt. She doubted it. But it didn't matter. Because the work wasn't about him anymore. It was about the thousands of people like him. The systems that protected them. The cultures that enabled them. And the slow, painful, necessary work of dismantling all of it. One story at a time. One church at a time. One awakened person at a time. As for Thomas Walker, he disappeared from public view. Some say he's still consulting with churches, just more quietly now. Others say he left ministry entirely. A few claim to have seen him at conferences, still teaching, still training, still spreading his methods under different names with different packaging. But no one knows for sure. And in a way, that's the point. Because the problem was never just Thomas Walker. He was a symptom, not the disease. The disease is a system that gives individuals unchecked power. A culture that confuses authority with godliness. A legal structure that allows churches to operate without transparency. and a widespread belief that questioning spiritual leaders is equivalent to questioning God himself. Until those things change, there will always be another Thomas Walker. Another Grace Community Church. Another Eleanor giving her last $50 while the person she trusts gets rich off her sacrifice. The names will change. The locations will change. But the pattern will remain the same. Unless enough people wake up. Unless enough people start asking questions. Unless enough people demand better. And that's where you come in. Because you've heard this story now. You know the pattern. You know the tactics. You know the warning signs. And you have a choice. You can forget what you've heard. You can tell yourself it would never happen to you or your church. You can believe that your pastor is different, your community is different, your situation is different. Or you can stay awake. You can pay attention. You can ask the hard questions. You can demand transparency. You can trust your instincts. And you can refuse to participate in systems that prioritize control over honesty, compliance over growth, and institutional preservation over human dignity. That's the choice. And it's not an easy one. Because staying awake is uncomfortable. Asking questions can cost you relationships. Demanding accountability can make you unpopular. Walking away can leave you isolated. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is living in a lie. Participating in a system that hurts people. Giving your faith, your money, your time, and your trust to something that doesn't deserve it. And then, one day, waking up and realizing you've lost years of your life to something that was never real in the first place. Eleanor sat in her living room on a Tuesday morning, 5 years after everything happened. The sun streamed through the window. Her Bible sat open on her lap, pages worn and marked with notes in her own handwriting. Not a pastor's notes. Not a study guide's notes. Her notes. Her questions. Her insights. Her conversation with God. And she felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Peace. Not the manufactured peace of a perfectly structured church service. Not the forced peace of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. But real peace. The peace that comes from knowing yourself. From trusting your own voice. From building a faith that belongs to you, not to someone else. She thought about the $10,000 she had given to the building campaign. The money from Robert's life insurance. And she realized something. She didn't regret giving it. She regretted giving it to someone who lied about what it would be used for. She regretted giving it without asking questions. She regretted trusting blindly instead of wisely. But the desire to give, the desire to be part of something meaningful, the desire to use her resources to make a difference, those desires weren't wrong. They were beautiful. They had just been misdirected. Manipulated. Exploited. And that wasn't her fault. It was the fault of the person who took advantage of those beautiful desires for his own gain. She heard a knock at the door. It was Linda, one of the women from her Tuesday morning group. They hugged, made coffee, and sat down with their Bibles. They talked about the passage they had been reading. Argued about what it meant. Laughed about how different their interpretations were. And then they prayed. Simple prayers. Honest prayers. Prayers that didn't use fancy language or try to impress anyone. Just two women talking to God like he was in the room with them. Which, Eleanor believed, he was. After Linda left, Eleanor sat quietly for a moment. And she thought about the question people always asked her. Do you miss church? And the answer was complicated. She missed the idea of church. The dream of what church was supposed to be. A place where people loved each other honestly. Where leaders served humbly. Where questions were welcomed. Where vulnerability was safe. Where faith was explored, not mandated. Where community meant genuine connection, not just attendance. She missed the dream. But the reality, at least the reality she had experienced, had fallen so far short of the dream that she couldn't go back. Not now. Not after everything she had learned. Maybe someday there would be a church that lived up to the dream. Maybe someday she would find a community that practiced what it preached. But until then, she would keep meeting with Linda and the others in living rooms and coffee shops. She would keep reading her Bible and asking her questions. She would keep building a faith that was real, even if it was messy. Because messy and real was better than polished and fake. And she had spent too many years with polished and fake. She was done with that. Michael sat in his office late one night, reviewing applications from churches that wanted to work with his organization. Some would be accepted. Others wouldn't. He had learned to spot the red flags quickly. Churches that wanted help but didn't really want to change. Leaders who wanted the appearance of accountability without the substance. Boards that wanted training but weren't willing to implement what they learned. He had learned to say no to those. Because his time and energy were limited, and he wanted to invest them where they would make a real difference. He thought about how far he had come. 5 years ago, he had been a recently divorced accountant trying to find community in a new city. He had walked into Grace Community Church looking for connection. And he had found a nightmare. But he had also found purpose. He had found a calling. He had found work that mattered. And he had found a community of people, scattered across the country, who were committed to the same thing he was. Making faith safer. Making churches more accountable. Making sure that what happened to Eleanor didn't keep happening to others. Was it enough? No. The problem was too big, too systemic, too protected by law and culture. But it was something. And something was better than nothing. So he kept going. One church at a time. One training session at a time. One conversation at a time. Hoping that eventually, enough people would wake up that the system would have no choice but to change. And you, sitting wherever you are right now, watching this story unfold, you're part of that change. Because awareness is the first step. And you're now aware. You know the tactics. You know the patterns. You know the warning signs. You know that churches can be beautiful communities or dangerous cults, and the difference often comes down to one thing. Accountability. Are leaders willing to be questioned? Are finances transparent? Are dissenting voices welcomed? Is power shared or hoarded? Those questions determine everything. And you have the power to ask them. You have the power to demand answers. You have the power to walk away if the answers don't come. You have the power to find or create communities that are healthier, safer, more honest. You have the power to protect yourself and others. And you have the responsibility to use that power. Because if you don't, if you stay silent, if you ignore the red flags, if you keep participating in systems that harm people, then you become part of the problem. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. But complicity is still complicity. And silence is still a choice. So what will you choose? Will you ask the hard questions? Will you demand transparency? Will you trust your instincts? Will you speak up when something feels wrong? Will you walk away if you need to? Or will you stay silent, stay compliant, stay comfortable? Because those are the only two options. There's no middle ground. Not on this. You're either part of the problem or part of the solution. You're either enabling the system or challenging it. You're either protecting the institution or protecting the people. Choose wisely. Choose honestly. Choose courageously. Because your choice matters. Not just for you. But for everyone who comes after you. For the single mother who's about to give her last dollar. For the elderly widow who's about to sacrifice her medication money. For the young person who's about to be shamed into silence. For all the Eleanors who haven't yet found the courage to ask questions. Your choice could be the thing that saves them. Or it could be the thing that enables their harm. So choose carefully. Choose consciously. And choose soon. Because somewhere right now, in a church you've never heard of, in a town you'll never visit, someone is being manipulated. Someone is being exploited. Someone is giving their last $50 because they've been told that's what faith requires. And they're waiting. Waiting for someone to tell them the truth. Waiting for someone to give them permission to ask questions. Waiting for someone to show them that walking away isn't betrayal. It's survival. Will you be that someone? Will you share this story? Will you start the conversation? Will you challenge the system? The choice is yours. But please, make it count. Because faith is too important, too sacred, too beautiful to be left in the hands of people who would use it to control others. Faith deserves better. And so do you. This is the end of the story. But it's not the end of the conversation. In fact, the conversation is just beginning. Because every person who watches this, every person who shares this, every person who speaks up because of this, is adding their voice to a movement. A movement toward honesty. Toward accountability. Toward a version of faith that doesn't require you to check your brain at the door or surrender your voice to someone else's authority. A version of faith that's big enough to hold your questions, strong enough to survive your doubts, and beautiful enough to be worth pursuing honestly. That's the faith Eleanor found. That's the faith Michael fought for. That's the faith Rachel documented. And that's the faith available to you. Not in a building. Not through a pastor. But in the quiet, honest, sometimes uncomfortable work of seeking truth wherever it leads. Even if it leads you away from everything you thought you knew. Even if it leads you to places you never expected to go. Even if it costs you everything you thought you needed. Because in the end, the only faith worth having is the faith that's true. And truth is never found by staying silent. It's found by asking questions. By demanding answers. By trusting yourself. And by having the courage to walk away from anything that asks you to be less than fully human, fully honest, fully awake. That's the invitation. Will you accept it? The choice is yours. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for being brave enough to hear a truth that many would rather ignore. Now go. Ask questions. Demand better. And never, ever give your faith away to someone who doesn't deserve it. Because your faith is yours. And no one, no matter their title, their position, or their authority, has the right to take it from you.